Savage Bites, Episode 21. Hell's Bells. A subterranean bass riff clawed at the fringes of his awareness, an anamorphic sequence of braided chords cycling lethargically at the very brink of his perception, like the distant, repetitive call of some solitary foghorn, a beacon howling into the endless night of space. By degrees, the sounds registered, their chainsaw distortion chiseling at the shell encapsulating the void, penetrating the muffled silence of his blackout oblivion, sparking a reaction in the tiny flicker of consciousness that yet remained. Suspended in an immense sensory deprivation tank of grey meat and bone, floating languidly in an opiate sea, his eyes cracked open a quarter-inch, the brittle dam of sticky lids parting reluctantly, a deluge of blinding, flickering fluorescent light bursting through, pissing acid into his fat, black, hyperdilated pupils. He winced in pain, knuckling away the hurt with scarred fists. The sweet stink of the pissoir furthered the revival, triggered by the encroaching soundscape. Samael was awake now, one side of his face wet with stale urine. He gazed vacantly along the tattered plane of the vinyl floor, his thoughts a contemplative blank. "Where the hell am I?" he thought, finally. His inner dialogue, a slow, thick-tongued drawl. Outside the muffling confines of the prefabricated structure, the savagery of the acoustic panorama subsided, adopting a baroque countenance of subtle minor chords, as though heralding the arrival of some revered yet austere dignitary. Beneath it, the leaden bass plied on, and he noticed with a sense of detached curiosity that its relentless measured pace had devolved into a hypogean resonance that shook the very ground beneath his feet. He emerged from that stinking plastic cocoon on unsteady legs into a deafening maelstrom of driving void grind. Waves of toxic death metal washed over him, inundating his senses, bathing him in an intoxicating elixir of violent reverie. Encompassing him now was a vision of Valhalla. Multitudes of pagan warriors, bearded and unwashed, clad in leather and denim, capered in a dance of death about a blazing bonfire that occupied the centre of a vast pentagram, whose flames licked salaciously at the naked underbelly of a blood-red night sky. He was transfixed, fascinated yet stalled, unable to engage. He was, for the moment, merely an observer. A dark-eyed blonde emerged out of the night, thrusting something cold into his palsied hands, urging him to drink, flashing a ferocious smile as she slipped enigmatically away into the rayless shadows of the acoustic storm. Cold beer revived him further, its bitter foam stinging his parched tongue, quenching the fierce thirst that had gone unnoticed until now. Silhouetted against the blaze, the swaying horde danced on recklessly, each brain awash with its own unique narcotic cocktail, galvanized by the roaring dissonance of the music. Beyond them, something began to move among the flames. He swayed a little, his legs still unsteady, dilated pupils drinking in the chaotic milieu. His perception, sharpened now to a profound degree, was yet hampered by a mind mired in lassitude, dulled by overindulgence and fatigue. Nevertheless, that curious movement caught his jaded attention. What could it be? Something rose above the licking flames as he studied it. A long, slender shaft whose shiny integument gleamed in the firelight. The articulate thing unfolded, lowering gracefully, the heavy impact of its grounding masked by the staccato thud of the double bass drum thundering under the rising swell of the music. He blinked, knuckling his eyes, before squinting again at the place where it had been. It yet remained, and was joined by another, thudding into the ground beside it. Beyond these, a third limb loomed out of the fire. Samael raked dirty fingernails through his hair, scratching his scalp in nervous irritation. What the hell had he seen? Had anyone else noticed it? He wanted to speak to someone, to point it out to one of the others, to confide these fresh suspicions in communion with a fellow being, to confirm through shared observation the nature of those three curious pillars that, even as he watched, were joined by a fourth sleek member that came gliding out of the roaring fire. He wanted to speak, but was unable to act or move. His body seemed unwilling to respond. All he could do was observe as the great crooked torso, all bones and angles, rose smoothly above the flames. Then came the head, a great grotesque parody of a crocodilian skull mounted on a muscular neck. its gaping maw studded with 100 gleaming bayonet fangs. Its eyes were a blank blackness, 3 of them surmounting either flank of the flattened skull. Despite their alien emptiness, he felt it lock eyes with him, its head rolling several degrees to clockwise as it did so, much as a curious canine might do, the motion displaying a degree of awareness and intelligence that terrified him, perhaps even more than the raw visual of its monstrous form. He tore his eyes away, in time to see it joined by another monstrosity. The newcomer differed markedly from its fellow in physical form, yet retained a similar aspect of overwhelming existential horror and fascination that held Samael firmly in place, rooted to the spot in fright and bewilderment and disbelief. Somehow he couldn't bear to look at them, as though their matte black eyes burned into his, piercing the fragile film of bone protecting his brain, prying aside the doors of perception, rooting out the dark, dirty secrets hidden beneath the umbra of his quintessential soul. Breaking eye contact, his gaze slipped away, roving to the distant horizon where the great grey disk of a magnified moon hung, impossibly large against the cardinal sky. Silhouetted against it stood a vast something, a monstrous hull suspended miles above the surface of the earth on a multitude of thin, towering legs. In silent fascination he watched its ponderous movements across the many miles of empty air that lay between them, wondering what had happened to the world during the brief period he must have lain unconscious, lapsed in a drunken stupor in the John. It made no sense, yet here it was. As his eyes adjusted to the distance, other entities shifted into focus, great towering things that loomed above the earth like an armada of malevolent gods, stalking the land over which they exerted utter, indefatigable sway. The crocodilian thing shifted on tottering limbs, catching his eye, assuring itself that it held his unalloyed attention as it fell upon its prey. The great head struck like a cobra, snatching up its initial victim, flinging him bodily spinning into the air like a rag doll before snapping the screaming casualty in two with a lightning slash of savage jaws, the severed sections dropping out of sight behind the raving crush of cavorting devotees. Samael blinked, massaging the bridge of his nose with finger and thumb, as if to erase the sight from memory, to wipe its imprint from the glossy surface of his aching eyeballs. When he looked again, those great monstrous things were elbow-deep amid the crowd, snapping and slashing indiscriminately at the hapless drunken revellers, decimating them, engorging themselves on living human flesh. He staggered back in horror, dismayed and lightheaded, observing the harrowing panoply before him through swirling, kaleidoscopic vision. "I'm in hell," he concluded. Then he remembered the pentagram. Could it be that the ritual had been a success? Could a thing conceived and enacted merely as an ironic pretense have inadvertently provoked genuine supernatural efficacy? It seemed impossible, but the carnage raging about him was horrifyingly real. Suddenly he found his voice emitting a bellowing shamanic shout that rose queerly above the raucous din of the grinding metal and the agonized screams. The crowd finally broke at that, stumbling bodies fleeing and scattering from the fray in stark panic. Several of them staggered blindly in his direction, among them faces he recognized. Faces that transformed hideously as they neared him, melting into a boiling mass of infection and rot. Faces whose eyes multiplied like foaming bubbles, each new orb snapping open to observe him with sardonic malevolence. Faces that burst with a fresh growth of vicious fangs, propagated haphazardly in mouths that gaped wider than any normal human jaw. He lashed out, stunning the first of them with a practiced right cross that dropped the quasi-human monster in its tracks. A second was similarly felled before he turned and fled. He stumbled away into the dark, his breath short, panting with exertion, his mind racing in panicked terror. Ever and again he glanced back over his shoulder as he went. They were after him, dark shapes gliding through the gloom, barking and whooping inarticulately in charged bloodlust. He found his own bike among a dense tangle of twisted chrome and rubber, frenziedly kicking her to life as his pursuers gained ground. The deep, burbling bass note of the big twin built swiftly to a strident, gravel-throated roar as he wound out the throttle and took off. The tree-lined back road was a smeared blur of motion. The feeble beam of the bike's single headlamp bounced and quivered along the streaking tarmac, the animalistic roar of the motor echoing through the empty tunnel formed by the overarching trees. The cool night wind against his face and torso enlivened him, sending a palpable thrill through his body at this most basic concord with nature, with the corporeal world of solid, mundane reality. What he had seen had amazed and terrified him, had penetrated his soul, unhinging his mind, loosing his already tenuous grasp on existence itself. Now he was free, hurtling into the night on his trusty old Harley-Davidson. He sucked in a deep lungful of cold air, relishing its bite at the back of his throat, the reassuring solidity of the bike, the mechanical vibration of its motor, the subtle undulations of the asphalt surface beneath the tyres, all served to steady his overwrought nerves. A burst of maniacal laughter suddenly overtook him, a spontaneous outpouring of relief, the release of so much pent-up tension. But his alacrity quickly melted away, to be replaced by stinging sobs and tears as he caught sight of what followed, barreling behind him through the dark in his rear-view mirror. Those things were after him, hot on his tail, a horde of demonic hellspawn bolting along the battered tarmac in their fervent haste to overtake him. The crocodilian thing led the charge, its grinning jaws gaping in anticipation of the kill. At its flailing heels hurried a ragtag swarm of horrors, all gleaming eyes and grinning fangs and locomotive limbs, clawing away the miles as moment by moment they gained ground on him. Samael gritted his teeth and dropped a cog, twisting the throttle wide, gunning the heart of the old Harley till she screamed like the horde of snarling demons in her wake. Crouching low over the bars, he leant the bike hard into the next right-hander, his head skimming the overhanging leaves of the trees lining the road as he scudded past, taking the inside track. Without letting up on the throttle, he flicked the heavy machine over, deftly nosing the iron into a taut left-hand bend, the inside foot peg scraping the worn asphalt, leaving a long streak of glimmering sparks that died as quickly as they'd appeared. For the next several minutes, he wrestled the heavy bike through an increasingly challenging and dangerous series of winding turns that eventually opened out into a long straightaway. Snatching a desperate glance over his shoulder, he was elated to find that he was making ground. But his momentary joy turned to dismay as a hidden dip in the road dropped into a long right-hand bend that tightened sharply toward the exit. He closed the throttle and stomped hard on the rear brake, badly upsetting the equilibrium of the machine. But it was too little, too late, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it as the bike left the tarmac strip, spilling out onto the narrow clearing at the edge of the road in a shower of disturbed leaf litter. The rear wheel lost traction on the dirt, letting go, and the bike went down heavily. Samael went with it, sliding helplessly on his back into a tangled mass of bracken at the base of an ancient oak. By the time he'd regained his bearings, he was surrounded by the grinning horde. At their head was a humanoid thing, the mere parody of a man, his misshapen form heavily knotted with muscle and savagely scarred. The face bore little resemblance to any living thing, such was the severity of its mutation. The head was a squat ball of chewed flesh, split by a fang-studded maw, and pitted with a multitude of tiny, flat, black eyes. He sat astride a demonic mount, a great, muscular pig-like entity, the size perhaps of a Brahma bull. It too was scarred all over, its hide peppered with boils and open weeping sores. Great, cracked yellow tusks angled up from its jaw, either side of its single, gleaming, cyclopean eye, and its splayed hooves scraped and pawed at the ground with savage impatience as it gave vent to a deep, rumbling snarl. Behind it gathered a squadron of demonic outriders, black eyes peering out of misshapen skulls, all fixated on him, their foul mounts shifting and jostling one another impatiently. He was trapped and hurt, his mental faculties teetering at the extreme edge of sanity. He was done for, that much was certain. What they were, where they had come from, what had happened to the world around him. These questions had become merely academic. Their answering would provide no comfort, nor would they alter the inevitable outcome. All that remained unclear was when and how his end would come. A great, hard-crusted shaft slammed into the ground ahead of the pack, followed by another. Then the squat crocodilian head descended, drawing level with his own, inching closer. Its abattoir breath came in foul, panting gusts that brought a slush of bile into his throat as he retched. The maw cracked open, those bayonet teeth gliding to within a few inches of his face. The solid crack of a 45 round rang out. The lowering creature flinched at the impact of a shot fired at point-blank range. It raised its head in a reflexive effort to avoid the second shot. It failed. The third shot struck it in the throat, 3 more studding its exposed torso. Samael reclined against the trunk of the old oak, the smoking automatic gripped in his right hand, his knuckles showing white, head lowered, dilated black pupils staring wildly out at the surrounding horde, the desperate eyes of a cornered animal. The reptilian thing was alive, barely hurt by his fusillade of gunfire. It loomed over him, poised to strike. He knew then that there was only one thing left to do, only one card left to play. He jammed the square nose of the automatic into his mouth, chipping a tooth in his haste, angling the hot barrel upward, aiming it as best he could at the thickest part of the brain. There was a blinding flash of light and a deafening crack. Then nothing. Nothing but the blank, empty silence of the void. Feisty Frank Dettorino shut off the burbling motor of his chopped Harley, swinging his heel over the fat rear tire as he dismounted the hog. "Frank!" came a voice from the loose pack of bikers halted in the road behind him.
"Man, I told you shouldn't have spiked him with that Jimson weed. Jesus, look at him."
"Shut the hell up,"
said Frank, glancing irritably at the offending gang member. The other continued half-heartedly.
"That Tachura, that is some serious shit, man."
Frank silenced him with a withering stare.
"How was I supposed to know he'd freak out like that, huh?"
Frank rubbed earnestly at the fresh bruise on his jawline, where Samael's hard fist had struck it not long before. There was a lengthy pause as everyone took in the gruesome scene. Their friend's corpse, slumped like a rag doll, blood and brains decorating the gnarled bark of the tree at his back, the smoking pistol laying in his limp right fist.
"I guess some people are just predisposed to a bad trip,"
said Frank philosophically. The solemn group sat in silence for some time. As far to the east, the dawn of a new day painted the low clouds with light. You have been listening to Hell's Bells, episode 21 of Savage Bites, with me, Christian Bravery. This episode is the first in a 4-part mini-anthology focusing on psychological horror. So the monsters and cryptids and supernatural entities will be having a few weeks off. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I had a good time writing it. If you did enjoy it, then please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share with anybody who's interested in horror, creepypasta or anything like that. That'd be really cool. I'd be grateful. Yeah, so thanks very much for stopping by again, and I'll see you in the next one.